Okay, ladies and gentlemen, those of you here with us and those of you around the world watching us on Zoom, welcome, good evening. Good evening for those of us here in Jerusalem, and good morning or good afternoon, depending where you are in the world. It's evening here in Jerusalem at the Begin Center, and for those that don't know me, my name is Paul Gross. I'm a senior fellow here at the Menachem Begin Heritage Center, and I want to welcome those of you who are physically here with us to the center. And today is a special event. I'm going to ask people even more than usual to keep talking to a minimum, because it's going to be picked up by the Zoom. So those watching on Zoom will hear you guys hear whatever you're saying to your neighbor rather than what our panelists are saying. So we have an audience and guest speakers here in person, which I think during this crazy period in all our lives is reason enough to celebrate with a glass of wine or two. We're going to hear shortly from Adam Bellos, our moderator this evening and the man behind this event. I do just want to say before introducing him and our stellar panel that for us at the Begin Center, it makes perfect sense that Begin should be the model for Jewish pride. He was a follower of Zev Jabotinsky, who insisted that the Jews were an ancient and proud people with the right to sovereignty in their ancient homeland and the right and duty to defend themselves from the unique hatred directed against them historically. And as Prime Minister, he distinguished himself from his predecessors by identifying first and foremost as a Jew rather than Israeli. When asked by a television news reporter after his election victory in 1977 in what style he would govern as Prime Minister, he replied, in the style of a good Jew. Signon Yehudito. Very famous. And we are fortunate to have three fantastic speakers with us here, who in their own ways are forging a path in modern Israel, modern Zionism, and modern Jewish identity, and modeling many of the same commitments that made Begin so special. So I'm going to introduce them. I'm going to introduce our moderator last, because he's going to be our first speaker. But let me just go down the line. Michal Cotler-Wunsh, head of the Nefesh B'Nefesh Institute for Aliya Strategy Policy, scholar in residence at the Jewish Federations of North America, and founding member of the Interparliamentary Bipartisan Task Force to Combat Online Anti-Semitism. She was also a member of Israel's 23rd Knesset, where she served as chair of the Special Committee on Drug and Alcohol Use and chair of the Subcommittee on Israel-Diaspora Relations, and a member of several other committees, including the Foreign Affairs and Security Committee. She received her LLB from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, her LLM from McGill in Montreal, Canada, and she is currently a PhD candidate in the Human Rights Under Pressure. Human Rights Under Pressure, Ethics, Law and Politics program at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Note for later to put all that on one page next time I introduce myself, which is researching freedom of speech on university campuses, which I think is a very relevant topic in our times. Sitting next to her is Professor Gil Troy. Gil is a distinguished scholar in North American history at McGill University, an award-winning American presidential historian, a leading Zionist activist. He's the author of several books on both American history and Jewish and Zionist themes. His The Zionist Ideas, Visions for the Jewish Homeland was a 2019 National Jewish Book Award finalist. It was launched here at the Begin Center. And it has become, I think, the go-to compendium of Zionist thinking, both classic and contemporary. His most recent book, co-authored with Nathan Sharansky, is Never Alone, Prison Politics and My People. Gil is a regular interviewee on television and radio. He's published essays everywhere, and he writes a weekly column in the Jerusalem Post. And last but by no means least, Fleur Hassan-Nahoum, who is the Deputy Mayor of Jerusalem, welcome Fleur, in charge of foreign relations, international economic development and tourism. She's a co-founder of the UAE Israel Business Council, an association of Emirati and Israeli business and government leaders fostering bilateral trade, innovation and cooperation. She was born in London, grew up in Gibraltar, and studied law at King's College London, where she also served as president of the Jewish Society, and she made Aliya in 2001. And our moderator for this evening, the man behind the myth, the man behind this event, Adam Bellos, the founder and CEO of the Israel Innovation Fund. He's a serial entrepreneur who's worked in the United States, China, and Israel. Raised in Cincinnati, he served in the IDF and now lives in Tel Aviv. He has a BA in Judaic Studies from the University of Arizona, an MA in Middle Eastern History from Tel Aviv University, and he is responsible for all the wonderful wine that you've been drinking. He deserves that professional. Yes. Okay, without further ado, Adam.
is what happens when you're vertically challenged on the panel. Thank you so much for joining us here today. Do we want to just take a second to allow anybody that's standing, if you guys want to take some seats? If not, like you're cool where you are, there's a couple of seats over here. I just want to say a few words before we get to our panelists. This is going to be an interesting type of forum, I guess you can say. All the panelists have prepared 5 to 10 minutes of an opening statement in relation to what they do in connection to Begin. Phones on silent if we haven't already done that, which is always a great idea. I want to say thank you very much for everybody coming out in person. I understand that it's a weird time and it takes a lot of guts to come out to an event like this, especially with the weather. So thank you all of you for joining us. I just want to say a few things about the 3 panelists that we have, though. These are 3 very special people to me. I've worked heavily with them over the last couple of years since I've started TIFF. All 3 of them are mentors. They're also friends, and they're also doers. And if Zionism is anything, it's about doing, and it's about building, and it's about teaching the next generation about who they are, where they come from, and where they can go. And if there are 3 people that have ever displayed that action with some type of result, it's the 3 people that are sitting next to me. So I think they deserve a round of applause just for being here. My name is Adam Scott Bellos. If you haven't already figured that out, I'm the CEO of the Israel Innovation Fund. The entire point of the Israel Innovation Fund was to create a new type of institution, a new type of Zionist institution that would be built by my generation for the next, looking at different ways to connect and enhance Jewish identity around the world. Our phrase or our mission statement is bringing Israel to you and then you to Israel. Our flagship project is called Wine on the Vine, where we allow people to plant grapevines in all of the wonderful wineries that you have tasted. We actually have the CEO of one of our wineries here tonight, Jacob Ner David, one of my closest friends and another mentor of mine, from the Jezreel Winery. Sorry, I didn't mention. Yeah, I mean, like it's. I think everybody's drinking your Syrah right now. Like, not to knock the Shiloh or the Bravdo or the Yellow Valley. Like, we want to thank all of our. I want to thank JIC for helping sponsor the event. But I also just want to say something quick about the Begin Center and Menachem Begin before we get started. Since I moved to Israel 10 years ago, I spent my first 2 years in Jerusalem. And I remember the first time coming into the Menachem Begin Center. I found my Zionism in the diaspora, and it exploded when I was here studying abroad when I was 20. But when I moved to Jerusalem, I got to spend time in the Begin Center. And there was something about this place, its location and what it represents, that I saw this like greater vision for bringing younger people into it, and not only sharing the legacy of revisionism and Jabotinsky and Begin, but also the cultural aspect that they all believed in. And I saw this center as a place that could provide that for all different types of ages, demographics. And I just want to thank Paul Gross, who spent 6 months with me planning this event. We're very excited. We're hopefully going to be doing these every single month in Jerusalem, and hopefully we'll even be able to say it'll be a full dinner next time. I want to say hi, Mom, because I know she's watching on Zoom. And I want to say thank you to Menachem Begin before we even get started. Every session we're going to do, a different topic or a different hero. But I will say what I heard Daniel Pipe say the first time I ever came to an event here at the Begin Center 10 years ago, which is, it doesn't really matter when, but we're always missing Menachem Begin. So l'chaim to his legacy, l'chaim to all of you, and we shall get started. Who would like to go? Michal, would you like to go first? Okay, great. And I'm the last person to stand. We're all going to be sitting and enjoying ourselves while we drink our wine. If anybody wants to bring us a bottle, that would be great. Because I'm running low on my, And I know Michal. Once we get one glass in her, she's good to go. Yeah, we'll go with that. I have a question Zoom that will speak into the microphone. Yeah. And then, do you want to WhatsApp me if there are any questions from the Zoom?
So first of all, thank you everybody for being here. Thank you for Adam for putting this together. Thank you to the Begin Center, to Paul and Ritzi Mako, who's not here, for hosting it. And of course, thank you to my co-panelists and friends, Gil Troy and Fleur, who we share so much of, I think, what drives us in terms of vision and mission, values, and what we do. So it's a tremendous opportunity really to engage with all of you. And I look forward to the second part where you can ask questions and we can actually respond to what you want to hear. I will share a little bit and maybe begin with a personal perspective for some of you that may have heard this. I apologize. I was born in Jerusalem, and my mom was the parliamentary secretary for the then leader of the opposition, Menachem Begin, the Gachad party. My mom was a single parent. Then in the 70s, I'm dating myself, in the 70s, that wasn't so common. And I basically lived in Knesset because she worked very, very hard. So I was the beneficiary without knowing of really being privileged to know the giants of a generation. I can do a great impersonation of Arik Sharon playing hide and seek. I knew what, I won't do it for you now, but maybe later. I knew what colored paper was because Divrei Knesset, as some of you may know, come on different colors. Punch banana, which is yellow, I think, blue, depending on what stage of the legislative process they're in. At the time in Jerusalem, there was no real colored paper pads. You couldn't walk into a store and say, you know, well, so I would walk into the print press of the Knesset and choose from a plethora of colors and have this remarkable colored paper pad, not knowing how lucky I was, of course. And actually on the night of what's known as the Mahapach, I don't love the name. I don't know how everybody else feels about it. Upheaval's a little negative for me. It was a very positive night. The night of the Mahapach, I was 7 years old, sitting in the Knesset cafeteria, but I did not frequent my entire time in Knesset. My staff would laugh at me and say, "You've eaten there, let's go eat something." I was sitting in the Knesset, in the cafeteria, between the giants of that generation. I was the entertainment at a very, very tense night, not realizing how tense it was. Yechiel Kadishai, Esther Zion-Naor, and really privileged to be a part of what became this euphoric celebration on that night of 1977, when Chaim Yavin coined the word Mahapach. It was a non-existent word. And he was so taken aback with what was unexpected that he needed to find a new word and said, Gvirotai v'Rabotai, Mahapach. And Menachem Begin won. What I remember very clearly as a little girl, and soon I'll go into the Menachem Begin part, is actually the humility of a great leader that knew to look at every single person, including little girls, at eye level, that understood that his love for the Jewish people and his commitment to the unity of the Jewish people was so deeply ingrained that there was not one iota of doubt of equality between us as Jews. And at the end of the day, also understood our tremendous responsibility as this historic miracle was taking shape of the sovereignty of what it means to be not just geographically sovereign. And of course, we all know that he passed, when he was actually with a broken leg, he passed the law, the legislation of the Golan, of applying Israeli law to the Golan on one day. All three readings passed on that one day. Not just that kind of sovereignty, not just Jerusalem, but sovereignty of consciousness, the understanding that when you have a sovereign state, you also have a great deal of responsibility, not only to all of Israel's citizens and all publics that live here, but as the nation state of the Jewish people, to the entire Jewish people worldwide, and to Israel's standing in the international arena from that, what Paul said before, from that place of being a good Jewish leader. That's what he was. That was his identity, and it was very clear. But that did not mean or preclude the universal values that he represented in the human rights. And when I was sworn into Knesset, I began my speech, and I want to share with you the quote that to me really captures what guided or guides me, not just in Knesset, but his inspiration and legacy, of course. And the quote is, "There is no argument that in the hearts of all of us, in the heart of every Jew, there exists the highest aspiration, which maintains us, perhaps even more than we maintain it, equivalent to the saying that more than Israel kept the Sabbath kept Israel. The quest for justice, the desire to repair a world that ails with injustice, tears, persecution of widowhood, and oppression of orphans, ignorance, and lack of basic needs. Justice, justice for all. Education, education for all. Proper means of subsistence for all. A home and a roof for all. It is the eternal commitment that ignites the heart of every Jew. And I read that, and I began my own speech in Knesset with that, because my own life, my own personal life, took me to be privy to the greatest human rights struggles of, well, my generation, and maybe the former generations of the 80s, Soviet Jewry, and the struggle against apartheid, because my own father, who led those struggles, actually is still a human rights warrior. But the understanding that that human rights aspiration for all comes from a very clear place of Jewish identity, I owe a debt of gratitude to Menachem Begin for. And so, in fact, I can share with you that, when it was already 29 years ago, I think, with thousands of everyday civilians, I went to his funeral, to Menachem Begin's funeral, realizing that Menachem Begin is buried next to Feinstein and Bellows, that would be his last will and testament. I understood that good leaders know how to tell a story. Great leaders leave that story for us to tell. And by the very fact that every time that I have frequented his yahrzeit, his gravesite, next to him, I visit Feinstein and Bellows and remember that incredible understanding and the commitment to Jewish unity of, if anybody has watched the speech where, he alludes to the incredible responsibility we have to Jewish unity, and above all, the imperative we have to not see those divisions between us because of the places we come from. Mizrahi, Ashkenazi, he says, actually what he says there is Ashkenazi, Iraqi, Achim, right? And we all, I won't do the impersonation, I'm not very good at that, but at the end of the day, that is the story that he left us, and he left it as his last will and testament. And above all else, the commitment to serving the public, to public service that is not just humble in the way that I shared that he was, but that holds that so dear and near to his heart from a place of understanding of Jewish identity and the connection to the universal values and human rights are really what paved the path for everything that I do and continue to, be committed to. And I'll say, Menachem Begin considered himself the leader of all Jews, not just of the state of Israel when he was prime minister, but before he was prime minister. And another quote that I love to reflect on is the following, and it's about one of Israel's greatest challenges today. And I'll say a word about that, but first I'll read the quote. If the people want freedom, they must assert their rights on the House of Representatives as well, so that the majority, which serves the government more than it oversees it, will not deny them these rights. Democracy must replace government, he explained, as government unchanged becomes the rule over people rather than the rule of the people. And the understanding that he had to democratic principles, to good governance, to transparency, to accountability of leadership, to what we often are in the transition in the miraculous 73-year-old state of Israel, in the transition of looking at what we want to build for the next 73 years, that understanding of good governance, of transparency, of accountability of leadership is in many ways preceded its time. In many ways, he came with a new model of leadership that challenged the paradigms that were so deeply, and I understand where they came from. We discussed with some of the participants this evening out there, that I understand where they came from, but he really challenged paradigms that in order for the state of Israel to secure its continued existence, we need today. So if you said before, we miss Menachem Begin every day, boy, do we miss him at the intersection of what I referred to before and what I refer to often as the matrix of our three challenges. And I would say they are trifold. The first is in terms of Israel's internal resiliency. Arabs and Jews, ultra-Orthodox, secular, some refer to it as Israel Rishona, Israel Shniya, not my favorite at all, and I'll say why in a moment. But that is definitely something that I think is ripping us up at the seams internally. And that is a great challenge to this 73-year-old miracle, to us. The second is Israel's relations with global Jewry. What does it mean when half of us are living here and half of us are living in the rest of the world? And this is the nation state of the Jewish people. No matter what their regular, religious practice may be, no matter where they live, no matter all kinds of things that we have to sort of figure out, and we haven't yet figured out. And the third, and it intersects with the first two, of course, is Israel's standing in the international arena. And we maybe Gil will go into it a little bit more as well, but we see what has happened on campuses and in Congress, on streets and in corporations, in terms of Israel's very legitimacy, Israel's very right to exist as what it was founded to be. And I want to make it clear, Israel was founded to be, according to the Declaration of Independence, a Jewish and democratic state, the state to which an indigenous people, Jews, returned after millennia of exile and persecution in order to become the nation state for all Jews, wherever they may be, whether they come here or not, and that assures and ensures and secures equality for all individuals and minorities living in it. That's all right there, anchored in the Declaration of Independence, sadly never legislated into law, but in fact, very deeply anchored into the spirit of the court usually refers to the spirit of the Declaration of Independence. Those are the guiding principles that Menachem Begin understood so well. And so if I had to share the understanding of that human rights piece or the international law piece and give examples of that, we know of the way that he regarded the boat people from Vietnam. We understand that then, imagine today, right, with immigration crises and migration crises. Menachem Begin then understood from a Jewish understanding and perspective our responsibility and was able to enact and create a situation where the state of Israel, as challenged as it was, and I remind us, that there's a constant flow and absorption of immigrants to the state of Israel. It's not that the state of Israel doesn't absorb migrants. It has from the get-go. It has from day one. And if I had to say to that too, the speaking to the unity and his commitment to unity above all is that he did not see a difference between Jews, no matter where they came from. So yes, the human rights piece, but internally, if you sort of look back at history and understand that it was Menachem Begin who actually instructed the Mossad in 1977 to find a way to bring Ethiopian Jewry to Israel. We are still living with that today. I can tell you, as chair of the caucus in Knesset for Ethiopians in Israel, people would look at me and say, look at my color, and say, "You're the chair of the caucus?" And I'd say, yeah, why wouldn't I be the chair of the caucus? Because there is not one piece of my being that represents Ethiopian Jewry any more, any less than anybody who may or may not look like me, nor Jews from the former Soviet Union, nor Jews from France, no Jews from Canada, no Jews from anywhere else. And in fact, a little, fun fact, my parents met when Menachem Begin was then leader of the opposition. And my father, if anybody's ever seen my father, they know that he looks a little disheveled at times. And he came in as a disheveled professor to the Knesset and asked to meet with the leader of the opposition to report on, this probably, Syrian Jewry, the state of the Syrian Jewry. Judy Feldkar is a Canadian, and he had just come from Syria, seriously from Syria. And so somebody came into the office and said, there's a crazy guy out there. He says he's Jewish and he's just come from Syria and he wants to talk to the leader of the opposition. And said to my mother, she was his wall, can you go find out who this crazy Jew is? So my mother went out, and that's where she met my father, actually. In fact, they met around saving Syrian Jewry and bringing them to Israel and recognizing that the state of Israel, the nation state of Israel, has responsibility to Jews wherever they may be, and around the Sharansky case. So building the case and cause for Natan Sharansky, much more than just Natan, of course, all of Soviet Jewry. And understanding that Sharansky case is a legal brief would go to every head of state around the world and fight that battle as a human rights struggle. And so I have to just add one last bit, which will be hopefully my closing statement, and that is that tonight's event was named Hadar, right? Mm-hmm. And you use the word Hadar, and I think often people speak about his pride, but Hadar is more accurately translated into dignity. And the understanding that we live at an age, at an incredible age, where we have a tremendous responsibility to change this paradigm. Because this country was founded upon the understanding that it is a melting pot, a kul hituch, as somebody noted when we were speaking outside, a kul hituch, literally melting us together. And I very deeply believe that Menachem Begin understood as an outsider, as a Jew that came in, as an oleh, that became the leader of the state of Israel, always keeping the perspective of seeing Israel from the outside in and not only from the inside out. I believe very deeply that the biggest transition we have to make, and that everybody in this room, because all of you are Olim, I know that, or I think that at least, and everybody watching us, if they're abroad, has a very important role to play. That paradigm shift is the shift that the late Rabbi Jonathan Sachs termed as the dignity of difference. We need to make that transition, not for Olim, not for this particular group or another. We need to make that shift for the state of Israel and her continued security existence. And we need to make that paradigmal shift for her relationship with global Jewry. And we need to make that paradigmal shift in order to address the challenges that we face in the international arena in terms of international law and human rights that have been weaponized in the delegitimization of the state of Israel. That paradigm shift that understands and speaks actually the lingua franca, the language of rights that talks about inclusion and diversity and everything that and indigeneity, of course, and everything that we've learned, or some of us have learned if we've gone to law school, that has become the language of international law, is actually in the DNA that Menachem Begin understood way before his time of the demand of the future leadership of the state of Israel and its partner, the public, the entire public, Jews and Arabs, ultra-Orthodox and secular, Olim, young Olim, and by the way, it's a country of Olim. Everybody's an Olim from somewhere at some point, invariably. And of course, together with global Jewry. And when we say the word Hadar, I would be remiss if I didn't mention in this sort of context, the human rights struggle of our generation, and there are many. One specific one that I'm very, very engaged in, and I mention in this context because I believe that it is part of the paradigmal shift of the state of Israel rising from the docket of the accused and beginning to take its place in or around the table of nation states in terms of sovereignty of consciousness. And I refer to the case of Hadar Golden. I don't know how many of you know that name, but 7 years and 4 months ago, Hadar Golden, along with another deceased soldier, Oron Shaul, and by the way, 2 civilians, Avera Mengistu and Hisham Asayed, so an intersection of the entire Israeli public, actually. But Hadar Golden, as a case in cause, was kidnapped and killed, actually in violation of an international humanitarian ceasefire brokered by the United States and the United Nations, supported by the European Union. And for 7 years and 4 months, the work continues in creating or first challenging the paradigm that says that we cannot return our deceased soldiers or civilians other than in certain, using them as trading cards and certain sort of swaps of humans, whether they're alive or dead. The paradigmal shift that I speak to here and where I relate it to Menachem Begin is, of course, international law and human rights, understanding that there are foundational principles such as reciprocity that enable the state of Israel to also have rights, not only responsibilities, if it carries its sovereignty in a way that says humanitarian aid, yes, and we have humanitarian needs as well. Humanitarian needs of the state of Israel, in this case, is the return of 2 deceased soldiers and 2 civilians that have been held for 7 years and 4 months by a genocidal terror organization with whom actually the state of Israel is doing business. So money flows into Gaza and humanitarian aid flows into Gaza, and that very same genocidal terror organization that is hell-bent, and the last time I was here, actually walking out of here, was when there were 7 rockets fired on Jerusalem. It was Yom Yerushalayim, walking out of this center, speaking on a panel with my father about anti-Semitism. That same genocidal terror organization is holding 2 million civilians in Gaza as human shields. And our ability and responsibility as a nation state, as a sovereign nation state, as what we call a light unto the nations, is to ensure that international law and human rights is not weaponized in a way that not only delegitimizes the state of Israel or mainstreams anti-Semitism world over, but also demands of all those that are trustees of international law and human rights to hold to account those that are violating it, and makes very clear that when we are silent or ignorant or ignoring the violation, standing violation of international law and human rights, in fact, we are complicit in the undermining of the entire infrastructure that was created to uphold promote and protect those foundational principles. So to me, Menachem Begin is really a daily reminder of our responsibility, of the reminder for our generation, of the inspiration that he was. And I have to mention Aliya Begin, his wife, and maybe later we'll talk about her a little bit as well. She was the greatest woman and ahead of her time for sure. And at the end of the day, one last anecdote. He understood that it's about the next generation and about education. And you founded this organization in order to reach out to the next generation. And I recently met Aliya Strategy. She's a children's author. Aliya Strategy has written tens and hundreds of books about Israel's history and about all kinds of things. And when she was a soldier herself, she wrote her first book. It was about the Itzil. And her manuscript she sent it to Menachem Begin. She was a kibbutznik. She sent it to Menachem Begin, and she asked him for his approval. And did he have any facts that he wanted to correct and so on? And Menachem Begin asked my mother to read the book, to read the manuscript and comment on it. And she finished reading, and she said it's an excellent manuscript, and I think we should invite her in. And in fact, she came into Knesset, and she came into Knesset dressed in her army uniform, and there were some donors there, Nate Silver, and Menachem Begin said, this is the kid that writes for kids. She was a soldier. This is the kid that writes for kids. And Aliya Strategy said, I don't write for kids. She wrote a book about the Itzil. And he said to her, well, you should, because their minds and their hearts are still open. And so something else about the future generation and the responsibility that we have, our generation has, to ensure that what we leave the next generation is much better than this miracle that exists. And it's a work in progress. The work we have is daily, it's ahead of us, and he is definitely an inspiration, and his memory is one that serves all of us, and his legacy for sure instructs us. Thank you very much.
Now we'll hear from Gil Troy.
Thank you, Michal. Thank you to my fellow panelists, friends, mentors, and heroes. And it really is an honor to be a part of this. And what a thrill to be in the Kodesh Kodoshim of these values, right? And of this very special place. You can feel it. You can feel the values. You can feel the history. You can feel the story and the inspiration of the Jewish people. I'm not a fancy kid. I'm just a kid from Queens, so I didn't know any of these big names growing up. But when it was time for my bar mitzvah, we sent invitations to two celebrities. One was Henry Jackson, Senator Henry Jackson, who was fighting for Soviet Jews, and second was Menachem Begin. Now, there are two things to learn from that story. One is I'm really old. But the second thing was, what were those two role models? Now, this is New York in the 1970s. Nobody worshipped at the shrine of Menachem Begin. Everybody worshipped at the shrine of David Ben-Gurion. In fact, when Menachem Begin would be elected in 1977, Time magazine in its great moment would explain Begin rhymes with Fagin, right? Because no one knew how B-E-G-I-N should be begin, right? And I grew up in Salma Schachter School of Queens, and no one talked about Hadar, except for us. No one talked about Jabotinsky, except for us. And no one talked about Begin, except for us, because my father had been Maskir of Beitar in the late 40s, early 1950s, and actually helped smuggle machine gun parts to the Irgun and was supposed to be on the Altalena. And it's not that he missed the boat, but his mother wouldn't let him. Is that a classic? Right? His mother wouldn't let him on the ship.
I've never heard this story.
And apparently, and Jenny told me that he never forgave her mother until 1955 when he met my mother, and then the lights, opened, and all of a sudden the light returned to his eyes. But anyway, so I grew up with this notion of Menachem Begin, but worshiping in that shrine made me a weirdo. And we'll talk about the implications of that in group therapy afterwards. But when I saw that we were doing an evening about Hadar, it was indeed exciting. Is it dignity? Yes. Is it pride? Yes. But there's also a sort of glory part of it, right? It's Hidur Mitzvah, right? The celebrate. There's like a in America, there's this great constitutional term about penumbra, right, which comes from the moon, right? It's like what would we learn from Jabotinsky? What would we learn from Begin? That in a sense, at any moment when we're talking about Begin, we're talking about Jabotinsky, we're talking about this amazing state. we're not just living in 2021, right? We're living through thousands of years of history. And every time we walk into the room, and this was the notion of the Jabotinsky notion, this was the new Jew. When you walk into the room, you could be like Menachem Begin, a guy with a heavy Polish accent, and the ultimate expression of the old Jew, the ultimate dignity. And you walk in aware of the fact that when all the other people were savages, our people were princes and princesses. That we carry this amazing aristocratic tradition in the best sort of way. And we don't use it to make us say, oh, we're better than others. But we use it to make ourselves say, we've always got to be better. We've always got to be striving. And that's the power of chosenness, and that's the power of Hidur Mitzvah, and that's the power of Hadar. And if we're going to talk about Menachem Begin as a Jewish character, as a Jewish demut, as a Jewish image, I want to share, to me, the 5 dimensions of his Jewishness and 5 dimensions of his identity that can help us kind of contextualize this evening. But first, I want to make a second thank you to Menachem Begin, which is that a historian and someone who's trying to push us to change the conversation, change the narrative about Israel, he gave us the greatest gift. To this day, my friends from the left and my friends from the right fall into that whole delegitimization, fall into that whole Israel as the central headache of the Jewish people, and the central problem of the Jewish people. Fall into that problematization. Why? Because what's the history they tell of Israel? 48, 56, 67, 73 hike. We cannot allow struggle with our Israeli Arab brothers and sisters and with Arab brothers and sisters and neighbors to define us. And when we tell the story only through the wars, we do that. And all of a sudden, when you have to tell the story in 1977, the Mapach, well, all of a sudden you bring in domestic policy. And as an American historian, I always taught about the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, 80s. When I tell the story of Israel, I tell the story about 48, 56, and 67, of course, but I also tell the story of the 40s and the 50s and the 60s and the 70s. And in this very place, we're reminded of that. So what's the first obvious image? What was the Jew, the kind of Jew that he was? The revolutionary Jew, the fighting Jew, the revolt. And because I have to give you homework because I'm a professor, I want you all to go read his call on the eve of the fight to define the state of Israel to his people, not just to the Irgun, but to the entire Jewish world. Or read his call in May 1948, celebrating this miracle of the new state of Israel. Or learn the story many, many years later. After by the way, sidebar, one of the other great things was being in opposition for so many years and being so effective in opposition. And while I'm very happy that he won in 1977, since he left the opposition, we have not had an effective opposition. We've not had an opposition that knows how to be both extremely patriotic and respectful of democracy, and also extremely effective in working the wheels of the Knesset.
Yeah.
Right? There's no model like that.
8 times.
Right?
And I think Aliya Strategy said he's the only politician who lost 8 times that ended up becoming a PM.
Right, and to fail upwards is also, and to talk about resilience, right? And to stick to it, and to continue and to stay fresh when he finally becomes leader is extraordinary. But then he becomes leader, and it's almost 40 years ago. Israel goes into Lebanon. I'm choosing my verbs very carefully. We'll talk about that also in group therapy later. And a delegation comes from the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And a young, quite eloquent senator from Delaware starts speaking, and Begin, who was a wordsmith, is actually quite impressed by this young man's words. And first he's showing support for Operation Shalom Galil, Operation Peace in Galilee. But then, of course, he uses an opportunity to say, and those settlements, you must stop those settlements. I'm being careful of the wine, so I'm not banging on the table. And what did Menachem Begin say? Senator Biden, tables are for writing, not for banging. And then he says, I am a Jew, I represent 3,000 years of Jewish dignity. That's a fighting Jew. That's a proud Jew. And there's also sort of an obsession about the settlements, which we can also talk about in therapy. So that's the fighting Jew, not number one. The second image, the patriotic Jew. And to honor him as the patriotic Jew, and now I actually have to work through some of the issues that I had growing up, because I learned about the Altalena, and I learned about Ben Gurion and Yitzhak Rabin's sin against the Jewish people and against Jewish unity in the Altalena incident. Fighting on fellow Jews, blowing up ammunition in the Tel Aviv port when we needed it so desperately, not going for one more round of negotiation, one more possible compromise. But I actually understand there's also a certain need for Jewish unity and the patriotism that Menachem Begin showed by saying we cannot have a civil war. Being able to put aside the pain, put aside the anguish, put aside the anger. It's something we certainly need to learn today. How to have love for one another, even if you dare disagree with me. How to love for one another, even if you dare shot at me. Because we're one country, one people, part of one destiny. And then, decades later, to go into Camp David and those negotiations, the great right-winger, the great extremist, and come out with a peace treaty which with all its imperfections has held, a peace treaty that allows us to go away from the language, and we must go away from this language of the Arab-Israeli conflict, where we think, as the Palestinians want us to think, that we're stuck in the same paradigm, in the same despair, in the same lack of progress for decades. And instead add an S and call it the Arab-Israeli conflicts. And we solved the first one, more or less, with the Egyptians, none of the Jordanians. And most recently, you've done such amazing work in building those bridges with the United Arab Emirates and the Abraham Accords. And sidebar, I feel so let down by my fellow American Jews who have not celebrated that moment. When I compare the excitement in this neighborhood from the investment in the tourism, and the vision and the simple cultural exchange that's going on, and the way we almost, when people came from Bahrain, we almost pounced on them, right? Because we were so excited. And that excitement gap, because they've been yelling peace now. Well, let's just start with peace more. And that was Bacon's great insight. Peace more. So we have the fighting Jew, and we have the patriotic Jew. And then on that day in 1977, when he's elected, and he puts on his kippah, and he goes to the Kotel, and Menachem Begin, who didn't change his name from Green to Gurion, to Ben Gurion, or Shertak to Sharet, or Meyerson to Meir, but always stayed not just Menachem Begin, but Menachem ben Dov Yachasya Begin. That's how he defined himself when testifying before Knesset committee. And he goes to the Kotel and he prays. He becomes the first Jewish prime minister, not negating our past, but living in our past, building off our past. And that sensibility guides him, as Michal said. And that also allows this Ashkenazi, Polish, super formalistic guy to become the pop star to the Mizrahi community. Why? And not only that, they looked at him as a fellow Mizrahi. Why? Because he was a fellow Jew. And we could get beyond our differences. We acknowledge our differences, but we also acknowledge our unity. So the fighting Jew, the patriotic Jew, education is repetition. The Jewish prime minister. And now I break the paradigm. The politician is mensch. Not only do you go upstairs and you see that totally modest living room that he had, because he didn't have big money. And Begin and Ben Gurion hated one another, but when you also go to Sde Boker, you see the modesty of those two people. But you mentioned his commitment to the struggle for Soviet Jewry and for Ethiopian Jewry. And when he first becomes prime minister, and back in those days, remember how expensive, some of you were old enough, remember just how expensive it was to make international telephone calls, right? And this woman by the name of Avital Sharansky has been burning up the phone wires, trying to save her husband. And the bills have been mounting, and Bezek is waiting for a payoff. And Kadishai, Begin's secretary, comes up to him and goes, "Do you think maybe the government can pay these insane bills?" And Menachem Begin says, the government cannot, but I can. And he pulls out his checkbook and pays it. Do we have a leader like that in Jerusalem? Do we have a leader like that in Israel? Do we have a leader like that anywhere in the world today? The politician is mensch, and it's not a contradiction. I've never heard a sniff of corruption. I've never heard any rumors of him putting his hand in the pocket. Now that's the Begin we expect to hear. There's one more dimension, which also Michal alluded to, which we really must emphasize, especially at this moment in Israeli history. And it's Menachem Begin as liberal democratic Jew, as a human rights activist, as someone who knew how ugly the West could be because he mourned what the Shoah had done, not just to his family, but to his people every single day of his life. He lived it, he felt it. He knew what Western ideals could turn into without a soul, and was all about efficiency. But he also, as a trained lawyer, as a Jabotinskian, as a proud Jew, as a modern Jew, he also understood the importance of democracy and the importance of lowercase l liberalism and startup nation and the capitalist nation, and all that is thanks to the 1977 moment of the Mapach, and thanks to that little man named Menachem Begin. And when he said, "Yesh shoftim b'Yerushalayim," there are judges in Jerusalem, he was saying to the Likud party of today. I'm sorry if I'm getting political.
It's fine.
No, actually, I'm not.
I'm totally cool with that.
And he was saying to every one of the demagogues of today, we do need not just judges, but civil rights and civil liberties and human rights. And his ability to show that all these were dimensions but not contradictions. And to teach us and remind us, where does democracy come from? Before we get to the Greeks, the Bible. Tzelem Elokim, Shivyon, right? Equality. That it's not always a contradiction. There are sometimes paradoxes, sometimes dilemmas, sometimes complexities. But the fighting Jew and the patriotic Jew, and the first Jewish prime minister and the politician is Mensch, and the liberal democratic Jew didn't live in constant combat with one another, but lived in the kind of harmony and dignity that also is about Hadar. Thank you very much.
Before we go to Fleur, I just want to say that I have chills. I don't know about anybody else after just chills. Wine is available if anybody wants to get up really quickly and refill their glass that's in the room. And then while we're doing that, are we? Oh, okay, great. So somebody will come around with some white wine, I guess. We have premier service here. I'm just gonna unhook this mic while we're doing that, so that we have this for the Q&A. What do you want?
Someone charge.
Have you been waiting this whole time? I do. I know that So for all the people on Zoom, we're just refilling our wine glasses right now. And we invite you to go to israelwines.com and order all of your Israeli wine needs, okay? Israel wines. You can find Jezreel Valley Winery there, Shiloh wine. Wait, we've got an open bottle. We've got an open bottle. No, we've got that. Okay, that's fine. Whatever. Don't worry about it. Don't touch it. Literally, that bottle is not Yeah, that's great. Does anybody want more white wine? See, this is how a Zionist salon is supposed to be. Good food, good wine, conversation, intellectual.
Adam, what about our?
Yeah, it's a good glass, huh? If we could please keep all of the corks for the open bottles of wine, because we're going to cork them. We have an event tomorrow. We're going to want to use them. Also, our panelists are going to. Do we want to get everybody back to their seats so we can hear from Fleur?
They together held on to a line between them. Not Rabbi. Not Rabbi. Same happened.
If I could catch the guy. That's destroyed the detail.
That was his analogy.
Is everybody hydrated? And yeah, of course. Does everybody have, it's Jacob. It's amazing because when you have good wine, everybody wants some wine, and that's what makes a good event. I only wish that everybody on Zoom right now could be drinking the exact same wine that we are drinking. We're just taking a few minutes to people that are on the Zoom. What would you like? Go ahead. No problem. Just take this. Fantastic. Right in the back. Okay, everybody, let's take our seats. Let's go. Let's take our seats. Can we have everybody take our seats? We have everybody take our seats. I will begin to do my Menachem Begin impression if people do not take their seats. Everybody that works for me says it's great. I don't think that that's a good tell, personally. Ladies and gentlemen, everybody at the door, do we want to sit down? Fantastic. Wonderful. I want to have Fleur Hassan-Nahoum, the Deputy Mayor of Jerusalem. Fleur, I actually got all three of your names right this time.
Just the wrong order, but no.
What did I say? Did I really do that? No, wait, there's this thing where apparently I can't register Fleur's full name all at once.
You and about 70% of
No,
the country.
I'm good. I am very good at names, and like it's weird that I can't do that.
Hassan comes first.
Yeah, it's Fleur Hassan-Nahoum. Fleur comes first, then Hassan, then Nahoum. So we're going to hear from Fleur about Begin and Jerusalem and his legacy. If I'm correct, that's what you're going to be speaking about, and the social mobility of Mizrahim under his administration. And then we will, go to Q&A. And there.
Yeah, I'm drunk.
You're drunk, and you want to hear my voice.
This is the best time to hear me, when you're all drunk.
I was gonna say.
I did it on purpose. I wanted them to speak, get the intellectual stuff out of the way. And now is the fun stuff. So, first of all, Adam, thank you so much for being one of the young leaders that is constantly thinking about ways of redefining how we connect with Zionism and making it current and making it relevant. So thank you, really, thank you. Thank you to the Begin Center, which to me is any Marisha Bat Bayit. This is a very important place for our city, Jerusalem. I come here to many, many events, and I'm also part of the group within the Likud called Kvutzat Moreshet Begin, and we do a lot of events here, and I'm very, very proud to be part of that group within the Likud, which brings me really what I wanted to say about the Likud today. I know that there have been kind of hints that we somehow have kind of come apart from where we used to be in the times of Begin and what Jabotinsky kind of envisioned for the party. And, there's always things that we can say to criticize, I think, any political party today. I think politics today has become very, very divisive. But I have to say, as somebody who is part of the Likud party, very proud member, I'm also a central committee member, I'm also a member of the executive board of the World Likud organization. It's very difficult to talk about one Likud when there's 130,000 members. And I have to tell you that the reason I joined the Likud in the first place is, first of all, because of the inspiration of Begin and Jabotinsky. And I don't know what's happening this week, but on Sunday there's a Jabotinsky conference and I've been invited to speak. So this is kind of the week of the history of the people that inspired me to join this political party. And I have to say that 130,000 members of the Likud means that the Likud is a very diverse party with the only, I would say today, one of the only parties that has a democratic mangenon, has a democratic mechanism within the party where somebody like me, who is an immigrant, who wasn't born here, who doesn't have connections, who didn't come here with connections, pre-existing connections here, can rise through the ranks of a party as a total kind of immigrant who did not have a network within the Israeli political system. And that is part of the reason why I'm proud to be a Likud member. And yes, there are people that, you want to roll your eyes sometimes when they're open their mouths. But for the most part, it is a glorious party with a glorious history, thanks to Begin's Moreshet, that I'm very proud to be a member of, and that has the diversity from Haredim to LGBT. All of these people exist within one party, and I'm very proud to be part of that party. So I wanted to start by saying that. Jerusalem, I want to talk about three things. Begin, and then I'd much rather this be a conversation and have questions. And I have to say one more thing. I am humbled by my two co-panelists. Michal, who did incredible work in the Knesset and is an academic and is, a warrior for the rights of Olim in this country, is really. She can be fighting and she can also give you a legal lecture on human rights, and not many people can do both things. And Gil, I was at Gil's, why do I forget English? I was in your book launch here 4 years ago. And I'm proud to be standing and sitting next to you today. In the meantime, we also were together in Limud in the UK, and we had a wonderful time there as well. So if I'm in Gil's...
Back when travel was a verb.
Back when travel was a verb. If I can be in Gil's, book tours alongside him, I'm doing okay in life. So thank you very much, because you always teach me something incredible. So I want to say a few things about Begin and Jerusalem, about Begin and Mizrahim, and Begin and diaspora Jewry. So these are my 3 points. The first point, Jerusalem. I think that there wasn't a prime minister who was so connected to Jerusalem, A, as a capital city of the state of Israel and the Jewish people, but B, as the spiritual heart and soul of the Jewish people, as Begin. And the proof is, as Michal mentioned earlier, he was not buried in Har Herzl with the rest of the prime ministers and the rest of the leaders of the state of Israel. Where was he buried? Right here, in the Mount of Olives. And just the fact that he chose to be buried there, and as Michal eloquently put it, to be part of the story of Jerusalem is an incredible statement about where Jerusalem was in his priorities. But more than that, in 1948, Begin made an incredible statement about Jerusalem, and he used Jerusalem, and I like this, in the feminine. He said, she defends her people and her soldiers like a mother defends her sons. So first of all, the fact he's using the feminine for Jerusalem, 10 points. Secondly, the fact that it personifies Jerusalem as a caring mother, that, we know the history of Jerusalem. Everybody in this room knows 3,000 glorious years, but also very tough years of being killed, pillaged, raped, kicked out, brought back, kicked out, brought back. And then the Begin in 1948 comes back and says, Jerusalem is the mother who suffers, but protects her sons. And without Jerusalem, we don't have Israel, I think is the most bold statement of a leader of the state of Israel, of the modern state of Israel, about the centrality of Jerusalem and our capital city, not just, again, of the state of Israel, but of the Jewish people, of the entire Jewish people, as the beating heart and soul of our people. And without Jerusalem, we don't have an Israel. And so I very much connect to that. And the work that I do here in the city, I always try to make people understand that Jerusalem is not just the capital city of the state of Israel. It's not just the largest city in the state of Israel, but it's also the capital city of every single Jew in the world. And the connection between the Jews in the world and Jerusalem is crucial. And if there is a Jew in the world that does not see themselves in Jerusalem, we have a problem. And this is why the work that we do here is so important in 2 ways. One is in the connection of diaspora Jewry to the city, which means that this city can never be homogeneous. The city has to remain heterogeneous. Every Jew has to feel at home here. And the proof of that is that 2,000 years ago, when King David decided to choose Jerusalem as the capital of his kingdom, remember, King David is not from here. King David is from Judah. Judah is Hebron. Why did King David not make Hebron his kind of capital, his town, the capital of the Jewish kingdom? And the reason we didn't is because he picked a place where all the tribes could feel at home. Jerusalem didn't belong to any tribe. It was in the border of Judah and Benjamin, but it didn't belong to any tribe. We're now in a place that didn't belong to the tribe, and that this was crucial. He wanted every Jew to connect to one place and not one place be the ownership of one particular tribe. And this is the legacy that then Begin brought, which means that everybody, every Jew should connect together to Jerusalem, to the state of Israel, and feel at home here. And that is really the legacy that we try and bring forward. And that's one of the reasons why, one of the reasons why I connected to the party that he brought to government. The second thing that brings me very close to Begin is the whole Mizrahi thing. Okay, and then this is really important because I am a proud Mizrahi, Sephardi, whatever you want to call it. I always call myself Sephardi. Mizrahim is what Israelis use. I'm good with everything. I don't have a pick. The point is Jews from Arab or Muslim lands. I come from Gibraltar, which is in southern Spain. The Jews from Spain that live in Gibraltar were Jews that lived in peace with Muslims in Spain before the Crusades kicked us out. And my mother's side are from Morocco. I'm married to an Iraqi Jew. And so, the fact that Begin basically brought the subject of discrimination into the forefront and said, we're not going to have it. And the fact that then he basically brought in and embraced the Mizrahi Jews to the party of the Likud. And the fact that till today, in the Likud, the Begin era is very much revered, remembered, and still very much glorified is something that I connect to very much. I think that, I grew up in a majority Sephardi community, so I never realized that Sephardi Jews were discriminated against because I was a majority. I didn't think about it. Then I went to England and I studied and I lived there for 9 years. And I realized that actually Sephardis are in the minority in England, but I didn't have any particular discrimination. It doesn't really happen so much in the diaspora. And then when I came to Israel and I realized there's a whole kind of thing about Sephardi being discriminated, it was a new thing to me. I knew it intellectually, but I didn't understand it emotionally until I got here. And how people are so kind of hurt by this and so hard done by this. And how Begin basically redressed that balance and how Begin said, enough is enough of this kind of Ashkenazi patronization of all the Jews. We're all siblings. And, the way that my sister says, we're all from the same bus from Egypt. What is everybody getting excited about? Every single Jewish community thinks they're the aristocracy. Let's just, we're all from the same place. Let's just start with that. And the way that Begin basically advocated for that, fought for that, and transformed Israeli society as a result of that is the second reason that I connect to Begin and his legacy. And the third is, of course, what Michal was talking about, diaspora Jewry, as the fact that Begin didn't see himself just as the prime minister of the state of Israel, but also as the leader, as the prime minister of all of Jewish people. And I think that today, and I have to say this because I'm just so exhausted by what's going on right now and the way that Israel is shutting its doors to the diaspora. That's what's happening. Sugarcoat it any way you want. But diaspora Jews cannot come to Israel right now. And we cannot say that we're the country of every Jew around the world and not let them come in. And so if this is what's happening right now, and there are reasons, I'm not saying there are no public health reasons for this, and I'm not saying that some of the hysteria is not justified, some of it is. I think we've gone a bit far with the hysteria at the moment. But I want to remind people that Begin at some point floated the idea of giving Jews that lived in Arab countries citizenship in order for the state of Israel to protect them. This was his idea, and this was the spirit of how he ruled. Now, if this is what he was thinking then, what on earth are we doing now? Well, we're shutting our doors. Let's forget tourism for a second, okay? Let's forget tourism for a second. But the things that Michal was fighting for in the Knesset, and I fight for in the city, you know, the basic rights of immigrants like us to let our families come for the most basic things like simchas and, you know, lo aleinu, tragedies, and the fact that we're shutting our doors. I don't think the government understand the damage that they're doing. I don't think they understand it. I don't think anybody's doing this. I don't think anybody's doing this maliciously, but I think people are doing it out of complete ignorance. Ignorance for the fact that our ecosystem does not stop in the borders of the state of Israel. And that is what's going on right now. And Begin knew this because he was like us, an immigrant. So he understood that our ecosystems, our families, and our communities go well beyond the borders of our country. And if there's something that should come out of this evening, is really the understanding that we don't need to invent anything new to understand how this country should be run. We should look at our fathers of Zionism, also at our mothers of Zionism, but that's a whole other lecture that I have. But our fathers of Zionism, and first and foremost, one of the top, of course, fathers of Zionism is Menachem Begin. And so we certainly miss him, but we should not look any further and look at his lessons and apply them and govern the country today in his spirit. Thank you so much.
Well, I think that was really beautifully said by all three of you. And I think it was an excellent way of bringing all of your individual expertise to exactly what you just brought to the table. I mean, that was very cool. I have chills. Like, it was
I think it's the
absolutely
wine
amazing.
by now. Adam.
Oh, it's definitely the wine a little bit. Like, I don't know if you noticed on the PR we did for the event, we found a picture of Begin drinking Israeli wine.
Yes.
Like, it was pretty cool.
And then you put me and Michal on the side.
Yeah, you wouldn't believe how many messages I got being like, oh my God, I love this thing with Fleur next to Begin with a glass of wine. You know, there's a lot of ways we can start in terms of the questions and the conversation. But I was having a call yesterday with my old college professor and very close friend who wrote the New Zionists, David Graysword. And he called Menachem Begin the people's prime minister. The first thing I thought of, believe it or not, was Princess Diana.
People's princess.
Exactly. And how for him, he was the type of man that was able to be approached by anybody in this country. And I guess my first question to all three of you is, what has changed so much that we can't have a people's prime minister anymore? And am I wrong to say he was the people's prime minister?
Shall I just answer that quickly?
Sure, Fleur, take it away.
So, I want to say that I think that a lot of what people admire from Begin is his humility. And I want to say one personal thing. My father was the first chief minister, the first mayor of Gibraltar, and the first chief minister of Gibraltar. And physically,
Didn't he found Gibraltar?
No, he didn't found Gibraltar. Gibraltar was there before he got there.
Like he was he started a national movement.
He brought democracy. You can say that he brought democracy.
Okay, so he just brought democracy.
Yes, but physically, my father actually looked a bit like Begin. So, but more than physically, the reason I love Begin is the same reason I admire my father so much as a politician, and that is because I'm going to say this without using rude words. He didn't think he was better than anybody else.
Yeah, please.
No, I
Be rude.
can't because they'll quote me and then it's gonna come back. I'll say it privately afterwards. So basically, I think these are leaders who really didn't believe they were better than anybody else, and they believed they were just like anybody else. And you know, and in the same way that the Begin was super humble and didn't want to fly business, and that's how I was raised. My father didn't want a government house, like a prime minister's house, because he didn't want us to have to move when he stopped and he didn't want us to think that we were special. And I always say to people, most parents tell their kids how special they are. My parents told us how not special we are, me and my sister, because they didn't want us to think we were more special than anybody else because of who he was. And that is very Begin-esque. And when you see the ridiculousness of what goes on today in the government and people demanding cars and more assistance and houses and the Khalifi wants a house as well. When you see all of that going on, you think we need a Begin who just didn't think he was more special than anybody else.
Put it very eloquently, it's modesty, it's humility, it's proportionality, it's that patriotism word that says that the state comes before me. I don't come before the state. I don't sacrifice the state's needs for my desires and my political ambitions. Let's look at two dimensions you mentioned, and we really should go a little deeper into this. The extraordinary relationship he had with his wife, Aliza. Relations between Menachem Begin and Jimmy Carter were downright toxic. They could barely be in the same room. And the reason why at Camp David, the couples came, Anwar and Jihan Sadat, Jimmy and Rosalind Carter, and Menachem and Aliza Begin, was because there was an understanding by the advisors that Jimmy Carter was very tied to Rosalind, and that if he saw the relationship that Menachem had with Aliza, it would humanize things, it would break the ice. And it was obvious Jimmy Carter had a big love on for Anwar Sadat. They weren't working on that one. They were trying to they were trying to ease things along in that way. And so and that was part of his proportionality, right? That was part of his modesty, that was part of his menschlichkeit, that's part of his sense of humanity. And that was so important. And then deeper, when we really talk about what was his Torah, right? What was his vision? It was really about the people of Israel coming back. And I think we have to put in the Shoah into this equation, right? And the trauma of the Shoah, and what he went through in the interrogations. And by the way, this museum is extraordinary. Paul, we should give you you represent the museum. What goes on here. I've been, my real job is being an American historian, and I've been to every major presidential library, and there's no presidential library that I've ever been to that so pulsates with the values of the person and his and his role models as this place. And it also doesn't give us a false happy ending, right? And we should also mention this. When we talk about his courage and his vision during the Lebanon War, let's talk about that utter sense of humanity. I have to go all the way back to the 1860s to Abraham Lincoln. And really, in all my studies of history, the only two leaders I know of who really felt the loss of every single soldier were Abraham Lincoln and Menachem Begin. And so when you talk about the people's prime minister, this isn't some sort of fake populism. This is a real connection with the people, and we know what happened at the end. And
Yehudim,
right.
Lochavim.
And I give some tremendous credit to this place for not giving a false happy ending and showing how painful it was at the end and how depressed he was both by Eliza's death, but also by the death of those 600, at the time of 600 plus soldiers. And that's a form of humanity. Now I could go on and be very good and not get into politics, but I will say something to also, what are the big differences between being a leader in the 1970s and being a leader today is security. The whole infrastructure we've built around the prime minister, and partially I acknowledge is due to the horrific threats they're under. But I always believe that if they just sort of jumped into a cab and went from place to place, they'd get there a lot faster, a lot safer.
And nobody would know they were in that
nobody
cab.
would know they were in that cab.
Exactly.
So what happens psychologically? I get it. Psychologically, when you are surrounded by guards and convoys, and every time you go, you impose real tircha on your fellow citizens, and you distance yourself, it plays with your mind, it messes with your ego.
Yeah, for sure.
So without getting into any personalities recently, and without getting into any of the problematics, I think one of the things that's happened in democracies today is that we've created these structures, and that's just one example of the kind of structures that distort. And so Begin, and that's why we can say Begin and Ben-Gurion, they were lucky in some ways to be leaders at that time, but they also, even at those moments, There were leaders who knew how to put their hands in the pocket. There were leaders who knew how to build themselves up. There were the leaders who knew that ultimately it wasn't about them, but it was about the Jewish people, and about the state of Israel. And that was Menachem Begin.
So I don't want to repeat what's been said. So maybe I'll actually share 3 personal anecdotes that corroborate everything that was said by Fleur and Gil. The first is my mom was the daughter of 2 Iraqi immigrants. And my Saba, who came from Iraq first, from Baghdad, ahead of his family at the age of 14 and worked really, really hard to bring his parents here, was actually a Talmid Chacham, but he did not want to belong to the Histadrut. So my Saba died a tailor. He was a tailor to his dying day. He made it count. I mean, he had the Etzel come with uniforms, and he also had the British Mandate uniforms, and then he would help the Etzel, and he made it count. But to his dying day, he did not fulfill his potential because he was an Iraqi who had made, the journey to bring the rest of his family here. And Begin hired my mom, the daughter of one of 7 Iraqi children of new immigrants to the state of Israel, and never, ever saw a difference between her or anybody else. So through that story, what I want to say is that sense of empowerment, and you made the equation to Princess Di, but really to be a man of the people, because he didn't see a difference between the people. It wasn't an effort, it was just what it was. The second is my own memory. I mentioned before that I was this little girl growing up, with a single mom in Jerusalem, not very common. I have a bunch of stories, but the one that came to mind, because Gil spoke about the distancing of leadership from the people, is that in the same very house that the Prime Minister currently doesn't reside in, because I live in Ra'anana, believe me, I know where he is.
Well, Saturday night.
But where he should reside, on Balfour, the Prime Minister's house was there. Same house, a little different, but same house, with 1 guard at the entrance. And I had piano lessons next door at the Music Conservatory every single Wednesday. And my mother was always late because she was with the boss. And so my second story is that the first time my mother was late, I went over to the Prime Minister's house where there was 1 guard at the entrance, and I said, hi. I was, 7 years old. And the Prime Minister's guard said, come on in, Aliza's home. And that became the tradition, I can send you a picture later, of me playing piano for Aliya Begin with milk and cookies until my mother came home with the boss.
Yeah, I want to see it.
I'll show you the picture. And playing a little bit of round of, piano for the Prime Minister. Oh my God. And I wasn't that good, really, believe me. Getting a nice round of applause and feeling like I was a superstar. The third story that I would share is about Aliya Begin, because we didn't get to her before. And I want to talk about the understanding that she had, not only in international relations and what she became his Ezel Kenegdo in that forum, but actually internally. And I, because my mother had nothing else to do with me, would invariably travel around the country with Aliya Begin and my mother when she started Project Pazot, Shikum Shkunot, so public housing, that actually appealed to the mothers, that would gather the mothers in order to impress upon them that social mobility would begin with where they lived, that enabling their children the chance for a better education and a better future. And that was Aliya Begin. And what happened is actually incredible, because she insisted to have the women come to the Prime Minister's home. I mean, I would fall asleep on the couch, but she insisted to have all these women once a month from all over the country dress up in their best clothes and come to the Prime Minister's home. They didn't have quite the wine we're having tonight, but to have the best possible food and be treated like queens, so that she could gain their trust and enable them with Shikum Shkunot to mobilize the entire family, sometimes alone with children, sometimes in difficult situations with a husband, without a husband, but to enable their children to have the social mobility, the better education, a better city, a better neighborhood. And it is a story untold of the incredible leadership of the woman behind the man that understood that to actually bring to light what this unity he was committed to and loving every Jew that he was committed to, translating it to the individual and to the family through mothers. And so I think that is, if I had to give you the sort of understanding of a man of the people and a woman of the people that they were. And the last thing I wrote to myself that I didn't say before, and Gil touched upon it, was the way that he served in opposition. And I wrote, he served like Her Majesty's loyal opposition. So not only was he in opposition for 29 years, not only did he create this constant shadow government understanding of democracy, so deeply important for democracy, because guess what, in democracy, it's not just coalition, but opposition. That's super important. Actually, I would argue more important in terms of the supervising of the executive branch. He understood it so deeply, but he did so with this loyalty that he never, ever spoke anything ill about the government outside of Israel, ever. And that was a big thing too. And I think, if you gave me that, sort of, again, far greater than Princess Di, sorry.
Oh, I agree.
Far greater in terms of the, people's person and what he represented in that way. So thanks. I heard that.
Good thing that wasn't like.
Yes, there was that.
Princess Di, please.
No, yeah, I have one.
Oh, sorry.
So there's one thing that I really would like to touch on, and then we can open it up for the audience, and if there's questions on Zoom, and I'll talk into the mic so you can all hear my horrible voice. How do I put this? I have 15 questions here. There's something that I keep going back to over and over again. And I have to say, Fleur, when I sent my email out with all of my questions, your response made my day. So thank you. Like, I'm glad I was super thorough.
This is so extensive. Go do your PhD.
It's like at least somebody recognizes the hard work I put
Yes,
into
you
it.
can put it on.
There's one thing that I think I've talked with you, Gil, a little bit about a number of times in terms of Tanakh and the importance of building Jewish identity with Tanakh as a shoresh. But it's very clear that Begin used the Tanakh on steroids, so to speak, in terms of the way he saw his role in the world, the way that he saw the role of the Jewish people in the world, the way he saw the emergence of the state of Israel, how he spoke, his education, his lived experience, and it created the individual that Menachem Begin was. And like we've all said multiple times here, we miss him, we miss those days. And one of the things that this billion-dollar industry known as the Jewish nonprofit industry, or the Jewish agency, the JNF, all of the large organizations spend hundreds of millions of dollars a year on Jewish education, federations, everywhere. And we are in a situation where assimilation is at a very high rate. Jewish illiteracy is quite high. And my question to the three of you, because you're all involved in this in different ways, is how do we create a new type of not only educational system or programming, but a generation of Jews that sees the importance of Tanakh as its shoresh in their identity, or like as this matrix that should bind them together with the rest of the Jewish people. Like one of the things that I think is very cool about TIFF, our organization, is that we've held more interns in one place at one time than any of the other organizations that do interns with Masa. And one of the things that I always like to tell my interns in the first day that I have them, other than handing them a broom and teaching them all how to sweep, because they're millennials or Generation Z and they've never been handed a broom. And that was my first job. And my father handed me a broom and he said, sweep. Like, yeah.
I have 4 interns, I'm learning something.
Yeah, I know. You got to start with the sweeping, like without question. If you can't clean a floor, what are you good for? Now I just lost my train of thought. So what I always say to my interns is you have to know who you are. You have to know where you come from in order to know where you're going. And if Menachem Begin knew anything, he knew where he came from. He knew where he came from. And I think that is the shoresh of the building blocks of identity. And so much of the conversation about Zionism is always about building identity, constructing identity, crystallizing identity. The Zionist movement was responsible for crystallizing a new national consciousness and identity. So I know it's not meant to be a loaded question, but what do you think is missing? Because that, in my opinion, is the actual root problem that needs to be solved. Sorry for the long question.
Go first.
And then we'll open it up after that.
I'll go first and I'll be very brief because So I don't think there's anything missing. I just think we're a work in progress. I think we're in transition. I think, I said before, 73 years of sovereignty and, after millennia of exile and persecution. And tomorrow is actually Yom HaSafa Ivrit, I mentioned before. I think that the centrality of the Hebrew language as a tool, whether you engage in Tanakh today or not, is something that's very sorely missing because you can't read the translation. There's so much that gets missed in translation. I think that the centrality of the Hebrew language was understood actually by founding mothers and fathers of Zionism. And it is something that we have to engage in our understanding of engagement with diaspora, that we cannot let the Hebrew language fall by the wayside. That's the first piece. The second piece in the understanding of Tanakh.
I agree, Hebrew.
The second piece, of course, of the centrality of Tanakh, of course, came into play even with his own wife, right? We talked about Aliya, and that's what he said to her when he was sworn in to government as prime minister. He actually quoted Tanakh. But the other thing that he understood from Tanakh and his mood, his image, as Gil said before, actually represents is the transcendence and the connection between time and place and space, right? So you said past, present, and future. And actually, it was Yigal Allon that said, Am she'eino יודע את עברו, ההווה שלו דל, והעתיד שלו לוט בערפל, right? עתידו לוט בערפל. So there was an understanding in secular Zionism too that we need to know where we came from. But understanding is not enough. You have to have knowledge. Understanding is just not enough. And I say often when I speak to students, when you read the Declaration of Independence that has the central, I believe, solutions to the three pillars that I spoke about before, whether it's between Israel and diaspora jury, whether it's internal Israeli resilience, and whether it's Israel standing in the international arena, it has all three right there in the Declaration of Independence. It is because Ben-Gurion was an Epicurus. He wasn't an ignoramus, right? He knew exactly where he came from. He knew very well. And the understanding that Tanakh is not a religious text, it is about identity, something that we have to engage in very deeply, and that without it, you don't understand. For example, and we're about to read this Parashat Shavua this week about the moral limits of power. That's what the story is that we're about to read this Shabbat, about the moral limits of power that comes from our own text, from our own identity, from our story. And I said when I started that a good leader knows how to tell a good story, but a great leader makes that story, the people that they're telling, that's their story. They will continue telling the story. We know from the Haggadah, we know how important that is, and the Tanakh is that story. So yeah, it's the Hebrew language, it's the text, and it's enabling us to be able to utilize it in our own lives and make it relevant in our own lives that we have to continue to engage in. The only one thing I'll say is I'm not despondent and I'm not at all negative about this in any way. And I actually quote the late Rabbi Jonathan Sachs in the differentiation that he made between hope and optimism. And he said as follows, and I'm very hopeful. And he said as follows, he said, optimism is the belief that everything's going to be okay, right? In Hebrew, yebeseder. Hope is the belief that we have to make it okay. And I'm looking at people that I know are a source of great light in that knowing that the personal responsibility that we have to make it okay. In that sense, optimism is a very passive virtue and hope is a very active one. And it takes not very much courage to be an optimist, but a great deal of courage to have hope. And I remind us that our national anthem is Hatikva, it's the hope. And so I'm looking at the generation that is still the founding generation of this miracle that is the Jewish and Democratic State of Israel. It's not what they didn't do then, it's what we have to do now. And the legacy, of course, that inspires us is very important, but it doesn't in any way mitigate or minimize the responsibility that we have in this generation. So, yeah, thanks.
I agree with almost everything except for the whole work in progress thing. In no other industry would a $6 billion industry be considered a work in progress. But Gil?
So at the risk of being a bit of a troublemaker, one of the things that we have to do with our voice is say to the government that when it comes to filling important roles like the Jewish Agency, it should not be a political football. And it should be based, it should be based on quality and vision and people who know what they're doing as opposed to people who are just sort of owed favors. But I don't know if that's relevant to anybody at the moment.
No, not at all.
That's number one. No, and number two, it means looking at the Jewish bureaucracy and asking the question of where's all the fat in the bureaucracy and where are we really making an impact?
Yeah.
And how are we making sure, you look at something, I'll be a little self-promoting, but as someone who's the voluntary chair of a program like Birthright, which is effective, which does move the needle. How many other programs do move the needle, and how many other programs which are, have very, very plush endowments and beautiful buildings aren't moving the needle.
Or CEOs with very large salaries
Yes,
of organizations that don't.
I too always
Have
say
results.
that the Golda Meir said you can't be a Zionist and a pessimist, and I'm a Zionist, so I'm not a pessimist. But I do have to share, and I think this does get to the contrast and then the core of your question, the contrast with Begin. I was in Florida about a month ago, Palm Beach, at a breakfast. You can't get any fancier. And I'm sitting with some of the leadership of the West Palm Beach community, which is the fastest growing Jewish community in America, even before COVID, when everybody started leaving the big cities. And the head of the federation, who also has kids in his teens, said something devastating. He said, a year and a half ago, when COVID started, the young Jews I know, non-Orthodox teens, cut off from being Jewish. And they didn't miss it. And they didn't miss it. When we tell the story of Menachem Begin, and we tell the story of how he could quote text because he had literacy, when we tell the story of Menachem Begin, and we tell the story about how he was living his experience in 1977 or 1947 or 1952, but also living in Jewish time, in eternal time, when we see how deeply Jewish he was and his peers were, and it wasn't optional, it was just natural. That's the gap. And so I could use it to steer to a woe was me, but instead I'll steer it to where you want us to go, which is that this is our goal. Our goal, and frankly, we have issues here in Israel too. Our goal is to make sure that every single one of our young people, in an age of so much me, and my, and more, and now, and rich, because really, look, we're the spoiled brats of Jewish history. Right? We are the highest, and never before in Jewish history have so many young Jews been born into such wealth and such freedom. And thank God for that. But if it becomes Avodah Zarah, it becomes idol worship, and it doesn't become an opportunity to say, wait a minute, now we have the resources at our fingertips, but are we really rooting our kids and our grandkids in this amazing story? Are we allowing them to live in multiple times? What a blessing that's been for me and for my kids. And for your wonderful children, Mike, you have the honor to know, right? And that's the power of living here. We're not just living in the moment. We're not just living in the decade. We're not just living in the century. We're living in millennia. And Menachem Begin lived in millennia. And so that's our goal.
So I'm going to be more practical and say that we need to find the young people where they're at. And we're not there. I think that the beauty of Judaism and the beauty of the Jewish people is our ability to adapt to the most difficult, impossible circumstances. And believe it or not, in this era of spoiled brats, I put my kids in that.
I'm a spoiled brat. Thank God.
When there's no real need. There's no real need. We're not where they're at. And where are they? Let's look for a second. Where are they? They're on Instagram, right? Okay, they're on TikTok, and they're on Netflix. Now, this is something I say to people, I'm like, yeah, what if the Jewish history, the history of our people that we're so proud of, that Begin was so proud of and so well versed in, became a 20-season Netflix show.
How about a movie on the Maccabees, like it's 300? Like,
Game of Thrones. How many times have you watched Game of Thrones?
I'm on the same page as you.
How many Game of
Content.
Imagine if we had
You want to read our content plan? Like, I'll
a
give it to you.
20-season Netflix show called The Choose. This is where they're at. I don't want to sound frivolous, but we need to go where they're at, and they're not where most of the Jewish organizations want them to be. You know, I used to be a communications consultant for 6 years, and the first lesson on effective communication is know your audience, okay? We don't know our audience, we're not making an effort to, and we're not going where they're at.
Can I
You have to go where they're at to bring it where you want them to be. We're here, they're there, and we need to go there to bring them here. And that's the bottom line, and that's my piece. We need to go where they're at, and they're on Netflix, they're on Instagram, they're on TikTok. That's where I see my kids wasting hours on YouTube and TikTok, coevely, but that's where they are. What do we do about it? That's where we go. That's what I'm saying.
There was a line that we used to use. We're getting off the topic a little bit, but there's a line that we used to use when we started. No, it's fine. We used to say that one fauda was worth 1,000 beneath the helmets.
Do you know what Fauda has done in the Middle East?
It's changed in the Middle East.
Fauda is the first show in the Arab countries. Do you understand that? In the Arab world, Fauda is the #1 show. Look what it is. Shtisel. Hasn't Shtisel made you feel a little bit more sympathetic to Haredim?
Yeah.
That's where we need to go.
Anytime you want to talk about making a movie about the story of Hanukkah, which is a national independent story, we'll have the talk. How about a movie on Herzl? But anyway, I want to open up to our audience because now we're in with Helen Mirren, which is going to be great.
Yes.
And there's no such thing as Jew face. Sir.
Talking about controversial, I'm going to be a little controversial. But with all due respect, I think one of the areas where outreach has been most effective has been with the Orthodox Jewish world. If you look at the statistics, the growth of the communities have been significantly more in the Orthodox world than in the non-Orthodox world. You talk about Eish HaTorah, you talk about Chabad, you talk about a lot of the other institutions they're not changing their message, but they're reaching to the people with the message. You're saying the education, the Torah values, and which are Begin's values, as you mentioned, and still, being authentic, and that is what people are being drawn to. So why can't we incorporate some of the Jewish education, a la Eish or a la Chabad, reaching out to every Jew without discrimination, but on a serious educational area to push for the millennium's rich history of our people.
I mean, I agree with you. I think that these organizations are doing a fantastic job. The question is not how do we reach the Orthodox? The question is how do we bring in the unaffiliated? That's the challenge. The Orthodox are doing a fantastic job.
You bring good Israeli wine. Just saying, everybody's having a good time tonight.
I just want to say that I'm sure Gil will have a lot to say about this actually, so I will give him the mic, but I just wanted to, I did want to say that I think as the nation state of the Jewish people, I think basically, if we're in a marathon or whatever, a relay race and we pass the baton is passed to the state of Israel, the nation state of the Jewish people to figure this out. That's the first thing. The second thing is that I think that there is a tremendous responsibility and potential of reaching across religious denomination, because what happened here in May, actually, ironically or not, alongside the tremendous challenges, is a tremendous opportunity, because what happened is the people who thought that they had a home, let's call it a progressive liberal home. No, though again, I don't think it's liberal at all. I think that, in many ways, liberalism was, hijacked. But what it means is the people who thought they had a home are actually homeless. And then the question is, what is the responsibility of the nation state of the Jewish people? And I would say it's to reach across real and perceived differences and to outstretch our hand and to create a sense that there is a home and a home in terms of identity. And that is not singularly with Orthodox communities or Orthodox messaging, because it's too far gone. So the assumption that Eish or Chabad will be able to reach everybody, I'd like to say that my and Gil's peers in Montreal, Canada, who've sent their kids away to very good universities, are happy if their kids are at all involved. And if they're involved in J Street. So we're not there. We're not there at all. And we have to take responsibility for that as well. So the lowest hanging fruit, yes, that's easy to do, except that we still have responsibility for the much higher hanging fruits in terms of engagement. And I don't think that it's that simple to be able to, use the same messaging which is reaching certain audiences and be able to adapt them to all audiences.
Yeah, I'm thinking maybe you're misreading what I'm saying, which is using the idea of Jewish education to retain our people.
Sure.
We
agree.
That to me is the key.
By the way, you're 100% right. It is the key.
Yeah.
If you don't have Jewish education, and Jonathan Sachs says this a lot, that's it. You don't know who you are. You don't know what your past is. You're 100% correct. But the question is, the kids who don't go to Jewish day school and don't have a Jewish education, how on earth do you get to them? That's the question. That's the challenge. It's not the kids who be educated Jewishly. They're still okay.
Next. Good days.
Actually, on good days.
On good days.
We have a question from Rabbi Ben Abraham.
Mordechai?
First, I wanted to say it's such an honor to be in the presence of everyone here. The dilemma is, it's like, I've been in Israel for 6 years, right? Came from America, came from Los Angeles, and boom, I get hit with the shock of the polarization that existed. So on one side of the point, you hear like, oh, well, you know what? Israel has this history, and it's Jews, it's this continuous right for determination. And then you hear the other side, which is like, well, like the Tanakh is like, it's not a religious document, it's a point of heritage, and it's our whole thing. And then you have the other side of Israel that's like, oh, we're over there, we don't agree with that, right? For me, coming from African American culture, so we believe in unity, that's the idea. So I was just sitting next to Rudy, and he was saying, like, he had this, I asked him, like, it seems like the country is going away from what we're talking about here with the Abraham Accord and all these different ideas. It doesn't seem like the country's going more Jewish or is going back to this original, Paninius that the country was built on. Is going into a more transnational concept, where it's like.
Can you make this a question?
Yeah, so the question is.
Sorry, I love you.
I love Adam. We got history. So
I got history with a lot of people in this room.
it's true. Adam's a man. The question is, and I want to hear what you guys are saying, but I also want to hear what Rudy has to say too, is how do we move forward to growing this amazing economy, but at the same time, preserve these Jewish roots? Because growing the economy means that there's going to be certain concessions that are going to make that are not necessarily Israeli concessions, right? We want to get to, we're the 8th largest economy, getting to number 5 is going to mean we're going to make concessions. So how do we move forward and connect to what we're talking about here, which is the original idea? How do we balance that? And I want to hear what you guys are going to say, but if it's possible, I would love, because I just hit Rudy the same question, I would love for him to throw out the same ideas.
Go on, Rudy, tell us what you have to do.
Please.
Hi, Rudy. What's your
It's
question?
the first time in a conversation, right away you out me to
That's it.
No, he's asking me questions about how I see the future.
First of all, let's give Rudy a round of applause. What he's been doing for Nigeria.
I think when we were in Nigeria, which this project is about bringing back the lost tribes of Israel, I keep hearing a lot of people say, no, focus first on what's in Israel and then bring them back. And the way I look at it is we were one image once upon a time, one light. The Romans smashed us into many different pieces. The Ashkenazim took logic and intellectualism. The Sfaradim took warmth and emotion and spirituality. And the right took the ideas of security and connection to a land. And the left took the ideas of human rights and values. We all took different parts of one light, but I think we're missing many elements of that light. And it says in the Torah that in the times of Mashiach, the lost tribes of Israel reunite from the four corners of the earth. And this is the times that we believe is Mashiach. And if you read this backwards, you need to bring in the lost tribes in order to get there. And they're also bringing in a piece of that light. But regardless of the lost tribes, I think the people that are living in this land are completely divided because of the system that exists, which focuses on short-term solutions. I'm not asking a question. They asked me to share my opinion.
But turn it into a question.
Sure.
I have a question.
I think that this creation that we've made is what we call in Kabbalistic language, Mashiach ben Yosef, meaning we've created the structure of the future of Israel, but we have the soul that's still missing, and the purpose of Am Yisrael, which is supposed to unite all elements of Islam, which we haven't been doing. And I don't think the system will be able to do so. I think it is the younger generation that will bring in that new blood in order to do so. And there are many ideas that we have in order to get there, but I think this question is, how do you see that happening?
So let me give a sociological answer and a biographical answer. Sociologically, one word: intermarriage. I love going to the United States of America, going to like the most Orthodox synagogue I'm invited to, and say we need more intermarriage in Israel. The more intermarriage there is between Mizrahim and Ashkenazim. Yeah, you were worried. Huh? The less we get into that fragmentation, and the more we bring it back. And if you read Shmuel Rosner's books, especially the most recent book on Israel Judaism, right? He talks about that too many of us are stuck in a paradigm from the 1950s or the 1970s of an Israeli Judaism, which is either chiloni or dati. I hate the word chiloni. I hate the word secular because I go to my secular Israeli friends and say, chiloni is secular. I go, great. There's a hot new restaurant that just opened up in Tel Aviv. I can only get reservations 7:00 on Friday night. Will you come with me? I can't go. I go, well, why not? They go, my mother will kill me. I go, why? Because she insists that I come to Shabbat dinner. And then you read in Shmuel Rosner's book that over 70% of Israelis not only have Shabbat dinner, but pick up a glass, right? And we know Seder, and we know, God forbid, when there's a tragedy, they said Shiva. In America today, you get a 3-day discount, but there, in Israel, we do the full 7 days. So sociologically, I'm actually more optimistic than you are. I actually am seeing more and more interconnectedness. I'm seeing that old-fashioned Ashkenazi thing of, I'm going to have my ham sandwich on Yom Kippur, which Dafka, by the way, showed tremendous literacy and tremendous engagement in the thing, because they were true Apikoursim. But that generation is gone, and I think I'm seeing more and more of a mix. I'm seeing more and more of a synthesis, and I think we have to actually update our language and our awareness. That's the sociological piece in Al-Ren al-Achai. The biographical piece goes back to the Star of Evening, which is Begin, right? And it was exactly Begin who was able to say. And by the way, one of the tragedies of the end of his life is he never wrote his memoirs. He wrote White Nights, which is extraordinary. He wrote The Revolt, but there's a missing third book, right? And that third book would be exactly that leadership guide, that ideological manual, that synthesis that we've kind of touched on tonight, but that we're really missing, which would be a way of saying we live in a world, especially today, right? Even back then, we're all really nostalgic about how perfect things were in the 1970s and the 80s, but we live in a world of the either or, where you have to go one way or the other. And fundamentally, the two, and this also touches on your question, I have two forms of Zionism that I ascribe to. I worship in the church of one, identity Zionism, which is that at the end of the day, these days, we have a state. Obviously, we still have work to protect the state, and obviously, we still have work to perfect and protect the state, but fundamentally, the state is okay. We have to work on using the state to raise us all up, to stretch us spiritually, intellectually, and ideologically, both our kids right here, and of course, people from abroad, and that's identity Zionism. And ultimately, and this really gets to Begin, is I say I'm a Fitzgeraldian Zionist. F. Scott Fitzgerald said that the mark of a true intelligence is the ability to hold two conflicting thoughts in your head at the same time. And if we go back to this whole evening, into this medley of ideas and thoughts and stories, what are we seeing? We're seeing somebody who was able to be deeply Western and deeply Jewish, deeply Israeli and deeply Zionist, an old Jew and a new Jew, and not see it as a contradiction and not see it as a civil war within himself, but as the Jewish character that he was. And that's what we need. And too many of our leaders and too many of our intellectuals, and certainly too many of our professors and our op-ed columnists are all in the either or. And so let's take F. Scott Fitzgerald, that overly drunken Princeton guy, but the theme of the evening also is wine, and learn from him to make those connections, to make those bridges, to celebrate the contradictions, not because they're against one another, because that's how you really create a new synthesis, a new vision for today and for tomorrow. Alt Neuland, looking backwards in order to look forward.
You know what a mic drop is, right? So you get to drop the mic afterwards. Well, I think it's time for us to, we'll wrap up with this last question. Just, can you make it concise? Okay, make it concise.
I want to know why polarization in our community.
That is the opposite of the beginning of a concise question. No, exactly. You should not need to get to something that is concise.
I will get to it.
Oh,
That is my
okay.
question.
Yeah,
If you listen to it,
yeah.
I want to know why there is so much polarization in our community.
I would like to take this.
Because,
Yeah.
because in the first place, if you touch ground without Judaism, none of us would be here. So when somebody says, and I hear that, Judaism or the Torah is not religious, it's an identity. To me, honestly, it's a bunch of BS. Because if without Judaism, none of us would be here. None of us. And so, again, to your point, that we can get from all places. At some point, you cannot sit on the fence. It either is or it isn't.
So your question is, why is there so much polarization amongst the Jewish
Because there
people?
shouldn't be.
Okay, I have a really great,
Because, hold on.
Yeah. Wait, hold on, I'm gonna summarize it
No,
because,
hold on, I need to summarize, because I'm gonna tell you.
okay.
Yeah.
So you have the question and the answer.
Right.
Okay, thank you. Does anybody have a question without an answer that doesn't want to preach?
Hold on.
Yeah, all right, so I'll just, no, it's fine. It's fine. Fleur needs to go to the bathroom, so like, it's okay. Okay.
This is very Jewish, by the way. This is very
What if I?
Jewish.
I don't know what to say.
Can you finish it in the form of a question?
Yes.
Okay, go. 10 seconds.
Rabbi, in World War II, we were, a lot more people died in the.
Okay, 10 seconds. Here's the answer. Read the book of Exodus.
You're not letting me finish.
Okay.
In World War II, a lot more people died because we're Jewish. Now, Jews are hating Jews for being Jewish or practicing Judaism. And I don't think that's right.
Okay, again, my answer to that question is read the book of Exodus. If you read Shmot and Vayikra, you can see that even when God was performing miracles in front of us, we were all bickering and had 72 different opinions. That's not me being sarcastic. That's a real answer to your question.
I think we have to respect the question.
for sure.
Respect the question. I think that we can be our own worst enemies. And actually, the thing that makes me the saddest is that the biggest anti-Semites and the biggest anti-Zionists in the world are Jews. This is really something that hurts me. And I feel like, don't you understand what's going on? And when you separate yourself from your people, somebody else will remind you who you are. And that's another one of the biggest challenges of our time. But because we have a history and a heritage of argument, which comes from, look at the whole Gemara and how we argue with each other about certain points and certain halachas and this and that and Hillel and Shammai and a million things. That's our character. Israel. Yaakov was changed to Israel, which means struggling with God. That's who we are as a people, which is our biggest strength, but it's also sometimes our biggest weakness. That's the nature of the beast. And we just have to preach love. That's it.
I just want to say one last thing about that question and in general, and to leave it on a much more hopeful note. I agree with Fleur 100%. It definitely is, a matter of who we are and part of our identity. But if you actually listen to the playlist in Israel, and I think that that's where there's a bit of a gap at the moment between what's happened in politics and maybe in the media as well, but where the public is, if you know that the #1 song of 2021 is Ishai Ribo, then you realize the public knows what it's doing. And this sense of disconnect is not really representative of where the majority of the public is. And I'm very hopeful, really relying on the deep rootedness of the Israeli public. It's probably because we have Hebrew as our language that we can connect to identity in that way, no matter what we come from in the past. And of that generation, this generation, it's an incredible generation taking responsibility for the nation state of the Jewish people and reaching it across the ocean. So I end this on a very, very high note. And I think that Menachem Begin was a role model, but that we have an incredible current generation that would lead us into a future that is really incredibly rewarding and fulfilling. So thank you.
You look at the relationship between Jabotinsky and Ben Gurion and Begin. They stood for nearly the same things, but couldn't get along and almost made decisions that were against, some of the successes of the future state of Israel. The Jewish people have always been a divided people. It's what makes us who we are in a way, unfortunately. To summarize, I just want to say thank you to everybody for coming. I hope this was, honestly, I got much more extensive dialogue from you guys than I even planned on. So thank you, Gil, Michal, Fleur. You guys are
Thank you, Adam.
absolutely amazing. Thank you for staying longer than expected. The panel ran longer. I just want to say thank you to everybody for coming. If you'd like, you can plant a vine at wineonthevine.org. I want to say thank you to Paul right over there. And I want to say thank you to my team who's been here since 5 and or really earlier. And I wish everybody a great rest of the week. And we'll be out there to talk and have wine. So I am and